And tonight's story, The Wendigo, by Algernon Blackwood. Chapter 4. But sleep, in the long run, proves greater than all emotions. His thoughts soon wandered again. He lay there, warm as toast, exceedingly weary. The night soothed and comforted, blunting the edges of memory and alarm. Half an hour later, he was oblivious to everything in the outer world about him. Yet sleep, in this case, was his great enemy, concealing all approaches, smothering the warning of his nerves. As sometimes, in a nightmare, events crowd upon each other's heels with a conviction of dreadfulest reality, yet some inconsistent detail accuses the whole display of incompleteness and disguise. So the events that now followed, though they actually happened, persuaded the mind that therefore they were partly true and rest of delusion. At the back of the sleeper's mind, something remains awake, ready to let slip the judgment. All this is not quite real. When you wake up, you'll understand. And thus, in a way, it was with Simpson. The events, not wholly inexplicable or incredible in themselves, yet remain for the man who saw and heard them a sequence of separate facts of cold horror, because the little piece that might have made the puzzle clear lay concealed or overlooked. So far as he can recall, it was a violent movement, running downwards through the tent towards the door, that first woke him and made him aware that his companion was sitting bolt upright beside him, quivering. Hours must have passed, for it was the pale gleam of dawn that revealed his outline against the canvas. This time, the man was not crying. He was quaking, like a leaf. The trembling he felt plainly through the blankets down the entire length of his body. Paegan had huddled down against him for protection, shrinking away from something that apparently concealed itself near the door flaps of the little tent. Simpson thereupon called out in a long voice some question or other. In the first bewilderment of waking, he does not remember exactly what, and the man made no reply. The atmosphere and feeling of true nightmare lay horribly upon him, making movement and speech both difficult. At first, indeed, he was not sure whether in one of those earlier camps or at home at his bed in Aberdeen. The sense of confusion was very troubling. And next, almost instantaneous with his waking, it seemed, the profound stillness of the dawn outside was shattered by a most uncommon sound. It came without warning or audible approach, and it was unspeakably dreadful. It was a voice, Simpson declares, possibly a human voice, hoarse yet plaintive, a soft, roaring voice close outside the tent, overheard rather than upon the ground, of immense volume, while in some strange way, almost penetratingly and seductively sweet. It rang out, too, in 3 separate and distinct notes, or cries, that bore in some odd fashion a resemblance, far-fetched yet recognisable, to the name of the guide. Defago. The student admits that he was unable to describe it quite intelligently, for it was unlike any sound that he had ever heard in his life, and combined a blending of such contrary qualities. A sort of windy, crying voice, he calls it, as if something lonely and untamed, wild and of abominable power. And even before it had ceased, dropping back into the great gulfs of silence, the guide beside him had sprung to his feet with an answering though unintelligible cry. He blundered against the tent pole with violence, shaking the whole structure, spreading his arms out frantically for more room, and kicking his legs impetuously free of the clinging blankets. For a second, perhaps two, he stood upright by the door, his outline dark against the pallor of the dawn. Then, with a furious, rushing speed, before his companion could move a hand to stop him, he shot out with a plunge through the flaps of the canvas, and was gone. And as he went, so astonishingly fast that the voice could actually be heard dying in the distance, he called aloud in tones of anguished terror that at the same time held something strangely like the frenzied exultation of delight. Oh, my feet of fire! My burning feet of fire! Oh, this height and fiery speed! And then the distance quickly buried it, and the deep silence of very early morning descended upon the forest as before. It had all come about with such rapidity that, but for the evidence of the empty bed beside him, Simpson could almost have believed it to have been the memory of a nightmare carried over from sleep. He still felt the warm pressure of the vanished body against his side. There lay the twisted blankets in a heap. The very tent still trembled with the vehemence of the impetuous departure. The strange words rang in his ears as though he still heard them in the distance. Wild language of a suddenly stricken mind. Moreover, it was not only the senses of sight and hearing that reported uncommon things to his brain, for even while the man cried and ran, he had become aware of that a strange perfume, faint yet pungent, pervaded the interior of the tent. It was at this point, it seems, brought to himself by the consciousness that his nostrils were taking this distressing odour down into his throat, that he found his courage, sprang to his feet, and went out. The grey light of dawn that dropped, cold and glimmering, between the trees, revealed the scene tolerably well. There stood the tent behind him, soaked with dew, the dark ashes of the fire still warm, the lake white beneath its coating of mist, the islands rising darkly out of it like objects packed in wool, and patches of snow beyond, almost the clear spaces of the bush. Everything cold, still waiting for the sun. but nowhere a sign of the vanished guide, still, doubtless, fleeing at frantic speed through the frozen woods. There was not even the sound of disappearing footsteps, nor the echoes of his dying voice. He was gone, utterly. And there was nothing but the sense of his own recent presence, so strongly left behind about the camp, and this all-penetrating, all-pervading odour. And even this was now rapidly disappearing in turn. In spite of his exceeding mental perturbation, Simpson struggled hard to detect its nature and define it. But the ascertaining of an elusive scent, not recognised subconsciously and at once, is a very subtle operation of the mind. And he failed. It was gone before he could properly seize or name it. Approximate description, even, seems to have been difficult, but not unlike the odour of a lion, he thinks. Yet softer and not wholly unpleasing, with something almost sweet in it that reminded him of the scent of decaying garden leaves, earth, and myriad nameless perfumes that make up the odour of a big forest. Yet, the odour of lions is the phrase with which he usually sums it all up. Then, it was wholly gone, and he found himself standing by the ashes of the fire in a state of amazement and stupid terror that left him helpless prey of anything that chose to happen. Had a muskrat poked its muzzle over a rock, or a squirrel scuttled down in that instant the bark of a tree, he would most likely have collapsed without further ado and fainted. For he felt about the whole affair the touch somewhere of a great outer horror, and this scattered powers had not as yet had time to come collect themselves into the definite attitude of fighting self-control. Nothing did happen, however. A great kiss of wind ran softly through the awakening forest, and a few maple leaves here and there rustled tremblingly to the earth. The sky seemed to grow much lighter. Simpson felt the cool air upon his cheek and uncovered head, realised that he was shivering with the cold, and, making a great effort, realised next that he was alone in the bush, and that he was called upon to take immediate steps to find and secure his vanished companion. Make an effort, accordingly, he did, though an ill-calculated and futile one. With that wilderness of trees about him, the sheet of water cutting him off behind, and the horror of that wild cry in his blood, he did what any other inexperienced man would have done in a similar bewilderment. He ran about, without any sense of direction, like a frantic child, and called loudly without ceasing the name of the guide. "Defaco! Defaco! Defaco!" he yelled, and the trees gave him back the name as often as he shouted it, only a little softened. "Defaco! Defaco! Defaco!" He followed the trail that lay a short distance across the patches of snow, and then lost it again, where the trees grew too thickly for snow to lie. He shouted till he was hoarse, until the sound of his own voice in all that unanswering and listening world began to frighten him. His confusion increased in direct ratio to the violence of his efforts. His distress became formidably acute, till at length his desertions defeated their own object, and from sheer exhaustion he headed back to the camp again. It remains a wonder that he ever found his way. It was with great difficulty, and only after numberless false clues, that he at last saw the white tent between the trees, and so reached safety. Exhaustion then applied its own remedy, and he grew calmer. He made the fire and breakfasted. Hot coffee and bacon put a little sense and judgment into him, and he realised that he had been behaving like a boy. He now made another and more successful attempt to face the situation collectedly, and a nature naturally plucky coming to his assistance, he decided that he must first make as thorough a search as possible, failing success in which he must find his way into the home camp as best he could and bring help. And that is what he did, taking food, matches, and rifle with him, and a small axe to blaze the trees against his return journey. He set forth. It was 8 o'clock when he started, the sun shining over the tops of the trees in a sky without clouds. Pinned to his stake by the fire, he left a note in case the Paegan returned while he was away. This time, according to a careful plan, he took a new direction, intending to make a wide sweep that must sooner or later cut into indications of the guide's trail. And, before he had gone a quarter mile, he came across the tracks of a large animal in the snow, and beside it, in the light and smaller tracks that were beyond question, human feet. The feet of the Paegan. The relief at once he experienced was natural, though brief. For the first sight he saw in those tracks a simple explanation of the whole matter. These big marks had surely been left by a bull moose that, wind against it, had blundered upon the camp, and uttered a singular cry of warning and alarm the moment its mistake was apparent. The Paegan, in whom the hunting instinct was developed to the point of uncanny perfection, had scented the brute coming down the winds hours ago. His excitement and disappearance were due, of course, to Then the impossible explanation at which he grasped faded, as common sense showed him mercilessly that none of that was true. No guide, much less a guide like the Paegan, could have acted in so irrational a way, going off even without a rifle. The whole affair demanded a far more complicated elucidation, but he remembered the details of it all. The cry of terror, the amazing language, the grey face of horror when his nostrils first caught the new order, that muffled sobbing in the darkness, And for this too now came back to him dimly. The man's original aversion to this particular bit of country. Besides, now that he examined them closer, those were not the tracks of a bull moose at all. Hank had explained to him the outline of a bull's hooves, of a cow's or calf's too, for that matter. He had drawn them clearly on a strip of birch bark. And these were wholly different. They were big, round, ample, and with no pointed outline as of sharp hooves. He wondered for a moment whether bear tracks were like that. There was no other animal that he could think of, for caribou did not come so far south this season, and even if they did, would leave hoof marks. They were ominous signs, these mysterious writings left in the snow by the unknown creature that had lured a human being away from safety. And when he coupled them in his imagination with that haunting sound that broke the stillness of the dawn, a momentary dizziness shook his mind, distressing him again beyond all belief. He felt the threatening aspect of it all. And, stooping down to examine the marks more closely, he caught a faint whiff of that sweet, yet pungent odour that made him instantly straighten up again, feeding a sensation of almost nausea. Then his memory played him another evil trick. He suddenly recalled those uncovered feet projecting beyond the edge of the tent, and the body's appearance of having been dragged towards the opening. The man shrinking from something by the door when he woke later. The details now beat against his trembling mind with concerted attack. They seemed to gather in those deep spaces in the silent forest about him, where the host of trees stood waiting, listening, watching, to see what he would do. The woods were closing in on him. With the persistence of true pluck, however, Simpson went forward, following the tracks as best he could, smothering these ugly emotions that sought to waken his will. He blazed innumerable trails as he went, ever fearful of being unable to find his way back, and calling aloud at intervals for a few seconds the name of the guide. The dull tapping of the axe upon the massive trunks, and the unnatural accents of his own voice became at length sounds that even he dreaded to make, dreaded to hear, for they drew attention without ceasing to his persistent and exact whereabouts. And if it were really the case that something was hunting himself down in the same way that he was hunting down another, with strong effort, he crushed the thought out the instant it rose. It was the beginning, he realised, of a bewilderment utterly diabolical in kind that would speedily destroy him. Although the snow was not yet continuous, laying merely in shallow flurries over the more open spaces, he found no difficulty in following the tracks for the first few miles. They went straight as a ruled line, wherever the trees permitted. The stride soon began to increase in length, until it finally assumed proportions that seemed absolutely impossible for any ordinary animal to have made. Like huge, flying leaps they became, one of which he measured, and though he knew that stretch of 18 feet must somehow be wrong, he was at a complete loss to understand why he found no signs in the snow between the extreme points. But what perplexed him even more, making him feel his vision had gone utterly awry, was that the Faigo's stride increased in the same manner and finally covered the same incredible distances. It looked as if the great beast had lifted him with it and carried him across these astonishing intervals. Simpson, who was much longer in the limb, found that he could not compass even half the stretch by taking a running jump. At the sight of these huge tracks, running side by side, silent evidence of a dreadful journey in which terror or madness had urged to impossible results, was profoundly moving. It shocked the most secret depths of his soul. It was the most horrible thing his eyes had ever looked upon. He began to follow them mechanically, absent-mindedly almost, ever peering over his shoulder to see if he too were being followed by something with a gigantic tread. And soon it came that he no longer quite realised what it was that they signified. That these impressions left upon the snow by something nameless and untamed, always accompanied by the footprints of the little French Canadian, his guide, his comrade, the man who had shared his tent a few hours before, chatting and laughing by his side. Chapter 5. For a man of his years and inexperience, finally a grainy Scot perhaps, grounded in common sense and established in logic, could have persevered even that measure of balance that his youth somehow or other did manage to preserve throughout the whole adventure. Otherwise, two things he presently noticed, while foraging pluckily ahead, must have sent him headlong back to the comparative safety of his tent, instead of only making his hands close more tightly upon the rifle stock, while his heart, trained for the wee kirk, sent a wordless prayer winging its way to the heaven. Both tracks, he saw, had undergone a change. And this change, so far as it concerned the footsteps of the man, was in some indecipherable manner appalling. It was in the bigger tracks I first noticed this, and for a long time he could not quite believe his eyes. Was it the brown leaves that produced odd effects of light and shade? Or that the dry snow, drifting like finely ground rice around the edges, cast shadows and highlights? Or was it actually the fact that the great marks had become faintly coloured For round about the deep, plunging hulls of the animal, there now appeared a mysterious, reddish tinge that was more like an effect of light than of anything that dyed the substance of the snow itself. Every mark had it, and had it increasingly. This indistinct, fiery tinge that painted a new touch of ghastliness into the picture. But then, wholly unable to explain or to credit it, he turned his attention to the other tracks to discover if they too bore similar witness. He noticed that these had meanwhile undergone a change that was infinitely worse, and charged with far more horrible suggestion. For in the last 100 yards or so, he saw that they had grown gradually into the semblance of the apparent tread. Imperceivably the change had come about, yet unmistakably. It was hard to say where the change first began. The result, however, was beyond question. Smaller, neater, more cleanly modelled, they formed now an exact and careful duplicate of the larger tracks beside them. The feet that had produced them, therefore, also changed. And something in his mind reared up with loathing and with terror as he saw it. Simpson, for the first time, hesitated. Then, ashamed of his alarm and indecision, took a few hurried steps ahead. The next instant, stopped dead in his tracks. Immediately in front of him, all the signs of the trail ceased. Both tracks came to an abrupt end. On all sides, for 100 yards and more, he searched in vain for the least indication of their continuance. There was nothing. The trees were just as they were, big trees, all of them, spruce and cedar and hemlock. There was no underbrush. He stood and looked about him, all distraught, bereft of any power of judgment. Then he set to work to search again, and yet again, but always with the same result. Nothing. The feet that printed the surface of the snow far below had now gone, apparently, from the ground. And it was in that moment of distress and confusion that the whip of terror laid its most nicely calculated lash about his heart. It dropped, with deadly effect upon the sore spot of all, completely unnerving him. He had been secretly dreading all the time that it would come. And come it did. Far overhead, muted by great height and distance, strangely thinned and wailing, he heard the crying voice of Paegan, the guide. The sound dropped onto him out of that still wintry sky, with an effect of dismay and terror unsurpassed. The rifle fell to his feet. He stood motionless an instant, listening as if it were his whole body, then staggered back against the nearest tree for support, disorganised hopelessly in mind and spirit. To him, in that moment, it seemed the most shattering and dislocating experience that he had ever known. So that his heart emptied itself of all feeling. whenever, as by a sudden draught. Oh, this fiery height! Oh, my feet of fire! My burning feet of fire! I ran in fear, beseeching accents of indescribable appeal, this voice of anguish down from the sky. Once it called, and then silence through the listening wilderness of trees, and Samson, scarcely knowing what he did, presently found himself running wildly to and fro, screeching, searching, calling, tripping over roots and boulders, and flinging himself in a frenzy of undirected pursuit after the caller. Behind the scene of memory and emotion with which experience veils events, he plunged, distracted and half deranged, picking up full so lightly the ship at sea, terror in his eyes and heart and soul. For the panic of the wilderness had called to him in that far voice, the power of untimed distance, the enticement of the desolation that destroys. He knew in that moment all the pains of someone hopelessly and irretrievably lost, suffering the lust and travail of his soul in that final loneliness. A vision of Pt.2, eternally hunted, driven and pursued across the skyey vastness of those ancient forests, fled like a flame across the dark ruin of his thoughts. It seemed ages before he could find anything in the chaos of his disorganised senses to which he could anchor himself steady for a moment and think. The cry was not repeated. His own hoarse calling brought no response. The inscrutable forces of the wild had summoned their victim beyond recall and held him fast. Yet he searched and called, it seems, for hours afterwards, and it was late in the afternoon when at length he decided to abandon the useless pursuit and return to his camp on the shores of 50 Island Water. Even then he went with reluctance, that crying voice still echoing in his ears. With difficulty, he found his rifle and the homeward trail. The concentration necessary to follow the badly placed trace and the biting hunger that gnawed helped to keep his mind steady. Otherwise, he admits, the temporary aberration that he had suffered might have prolonged to the point of positive disaster. Gradually, the ballast shifted back again, and he regained something that approached his normal equilibrium. But for all that, the journey through the gathering dusk was miserably haunted. He heard innumerable following footsteps, voices that laughed and whispered, and saw figures crouching behind trees and boulders, making signs to one another for a concerted attack the moment he passed. The creeping murmur of the wind made him start and listen. He went stealthily, trying to hide where possible, and making as little sound as he could. The shadows of the woods, hitherto far protective and covering merely, but now becoming menacing, challenging, and the pageantry in his frightened mind masked a host of possibilities that were all the more ominous for being obscure. The persistent of the nameless doom lurked ill-concealed behind every detail of what had happened. It was really admirable how he emerged victor in the end. Men of riper powers and experience might have come through the ordeal with less success. He had found himself tolerably well in hand, all things considered, and his plan of action proved it. Sleep being absolutely out of the question, and travelling in unknown trail in darkness equally impractical. He sat up the whole of the night, rifle in hand, before the fire that he never, for a single moment, allowed to die down. The severity of this haunted vigil marked his soul for life, but it was successfully accomplished. And with the very first signs of dawn, he set forth upon the long return journey to the home camp to get help. As before, he left a written note to explain his absence, and to indicate where he had left a plentiful cache of food and matches. Though he had no expectation that any human hands would find them. By Simpson found his way, alone, by the lake and forest, might well make a story in itself. For to hear him tell it, it was to know the passionate loneliness that a man can feel when the wilderness holds him in the hollow of its illimitable hand and laughs. It is also to admire his indomitable pluck. He claims no skill, declaring that he followed the almost invisible trail mechanically and without thinking. And this doubtless is the truth. He relied upon that guiding of the unconscious mind, which is instinct. Perhaps too some sense of orientation, known to animals and primitive men, may have helped as well. For though all that tangled region, he succeeded in reaching the exact spot where Paegan had hidden the canoe nearly 3 days before with the remark, "Strike due west across the lake, into the sun to find the camp." There was not much sun left to guide him, but he used his compass to the best of his ability, embarking on the frail craft for the last 12 miles of his journey, with a sensation of immense relief that the forest was at last behind him. And fortunately, the water was calm. He took his line across the centre of the lake, instead of coasting around the shores for another 20 miles. Fortunately, too, the other humans were back. The light of the fires furnished a steering point, without which he might have searched all night for the actual position of the camp. It was close upon midnight, all the same, when his canoe grated on the sandy cove, and Hank, Hunk, and his uncle, disturbed in their sleep by his cries, ran quickly down and helped a very exhausted and broken specimen of Scotch humanity over the rocks of a dying fire. Chapter 6. The sudden entrance of his prosaic uncle into the world of wizardry and horror that had haunted him without interruption, now for 2 days and nights, had the immediate effect of giving to the affair an entirely new aspect. The sound of that crisp, "Hello, my boy, what's up now?" and the grasp of that dry and vigorous hand introduced another standard of judgment. A revulsion of feeling washed through him. he realised that he had let himself go rather badly. He even felt vaguely ashamed of himself. The native hard-headedness of his race reclaimed him. And this doubtless explains why he found it so hard to tell the group round the fire everything. He told enough, however, that the immediate decision to be arrived at, that a relief party must start at the earliest possible moment, and that Simpson, in order to guide it capably, must first have food, and above all, sleep. Dr. Cathcart, observing the lad's condition more shrewdly than his patient knew, gave him a very slight injection of morphine. For 6 hours, he slept like the dead. From the description, carefully written out afterwards by this student of divinity, it appears that the account he gave to the astonished group omitted sundry vital and important details. He declares that, with his uncle's wholesome, matter-of-fact countenance staring him in the face, he simply had not the courage to mention them. Thus, all the search party gathered, it would seem, was that the Fago had suffered in the night an acute and inexplicable attack of mania, that he imagined himself cold by someone or something, and had plunged into the bush after without food or rifle, where he must die in a horrible and lingering death by cold and starvation, unless he could be found and rescued in time. In time, moreover, and at once. In the course of the following day, however, they were off by 7, leaving Punk in charge with instructions to have food and fire always ready. Simpson is possible to tell his uncle a good deal more of the story's true hinderness, without divining that it was drawn out to him as a matter of fact by a very subtle form of cross-examination. By the time he reached the beginning of the trail, where the canoe was laid up against their return journey, he had mentioned how the Fago spoke vaguely of something called a Wendigo, how he cried in his sleep, how he imagined an unusual scent about the camp, and had betrayed other symptoms of mental excitement. He also admitted the bewildering effect of that extraordinary odour upon himself, pungent and acrid like the odour of lions. And by the time that they were within an easy hour of 50 Island water, he had let slip the further fact, a foolish avowal of his own hysterical condition as he felt afterwards, that he had heard the vanished guide call for help. He omitted still the singular phrases used, for he simply could not bring himself to repeat that preposterous language. Also, while describing how the man's footprints in the snow had gradually assumed the exact miniature likeness of the animal's plunging tracks, he left out the fact that they measured wholly incredible distance. It seemed a question nicely balanced between individual pride and honesty, what he should reveal and what suppress. He mentioned the fiery tinge in the snow, for instance, yet shrank from telling that the body and the bed had been partially dragged out of the tent, with the net result that Dr. Cathcart, a jury psychologist that he fancied himself to be, he assured him clearly enough exactly where his mind, influenced by loneliness, bewilderment and terror, had yielded to this shrine and invited delusion. While praising his conduct, he managed at the same time to point out where, when, and how his mind had simply gone astray. He made his nephew think himself finer than he was by judicious praise, yet more foolish than he was by minimising the value of the evidence. Like many another materialist, that is, he lied cleverly on the basis of insufficient knowledge, because the knowledge supplied seemed to his own particular intelligence inadmissible. The spell of these terrible solitudes, I said, cannot leave any mind untouched, any mind, that is, possessed of the higher imaginative qualities. It has worked upon yours exactly as it worked upon my own when I was your age. The animal that hunted your little camp was undoubtedly a mouse, for the belling of a mouse may have sometimes a very peculiar quality of sound. The coloured appearance of the big tracks were obviously a defect of vision in your own eyes, produced by excitement. The size and stretch of the tracks we shall prove when we come to them. But the illusion of an audible voice, of course, is one of the most commonest forms of delusion, due to a mental excitement. An excitement, my dear boy, perfectly excusable, and let me add, wonderfully controlled by you under the circumstances. For the rest, I am bound to say, you have acted with a splendid courage. For the terror of feeling oneself lost in the wilderness is nothing short of awful. And had I been in your place, I don't know for a moment that I would have behaved with 1/4 of your wisdom and decision. The only thing that I find uncommonly difficult to explain is that damned odour. It made me feel sick, I assure you, declared his nephew. Positively dizzy. His uncle's attitude of calm omnipotence, merely because he knew more psychological formulae, made him slightly defiant. It was so easy to be wise in the explanation of an experience one has not personally witnessed. A kind of desolate and terrible odour is the only way that we can describe it, he concluded, glancing at the features of the quiet, unemotional man next to him. I can only marvel, was the reply, that under the circumstances it did not seem to you even worse. The words, which Simpson now hovered between the truth and his uncle's interpretation of the truth. And so at last they came to the little camp and found the tent still standing, the remains of the fire and the piece of paper sent to a stake beside it, untouched. Cash, poorly contrived by inexperienced hands, however, had been discovered and opened by muskrats, mink, and squirrel. The matches lay scattered about the opening, but the food had been taken to the last crumb. "Well, fellers, he ain't here," exclaimed Hank, loudly after his fashion. "And that's a sergeant's a kill ply down below. And where he got by this time, about as uncertain as a trade of cranes across the other place. The presence of a divinity student was no barrier to his language at such a time, though for the reader's sake, it may be a piece severely edited. I propose, he added, that we ought to start out at once hunting a farm like hill. The claim of Defago's probable fate oppressed the whole party with a sense of dreadful gravity the moment they saw the familiar signs of recent occupancy, especially the tent, with the bed of balsam branches still smooth and flattened by the pressure of his body, seemed to bring his presence near to them. Simpson, feeling vaguely as if his world were somehow at stake, went about explaining particulars in a hushed tone. He was much calmer now, though overwearied with the strain of his many journeys. His uncle's method of explaining away, rather, the details still fresh in his haunted memory helped too, and put a weight on his emotions. That's the direction he ran off in, he said, for his two companions, pointing in the direction where the guide had vanished that morning in the grey dawn. Straight down there he ran like a deer in the birch and the hemlock. Hank and Dr. Cathcart exchanged glances. And it was about 2 miles down there in a straight line, he continued, speaking with something of the farmer terror in his voice. And I followed his trail to the place where it stopped, dead. And where you heard him calling and cut that stench and all the rest of the wicked entertainment, cried Hank, with a volubility that betrayed his keen distress. And where your excitement overcame you to the point of producing illusions, added Dr. Cathcart, yet not so low that his nephew could not hear it. It was early in the afternoon, for they had travelled quickly, and there were still a good 2 hours of daylight left. Dr. Cathcart and Hank lost no time in beginning the search, but Simpson was too exhausted to accompany them. They would follow the blazed marks on the trees, and where possible, his footsteps. Meanwhile, the best thing he could do was to keep a good fire going and rest. But after something like 3 hours search, the darkness already down, the two men returned to the camp with nothing to report. Fresh snow had covered all signs, and though they had followed the blaze trail to the spot where Simpson had turned back, they had not discovered the smallest indication of a human being, or for that matter, of an animal. There were no fresh marks of any kind. The snow lay undisturbed. It was difficult to know what was best to do, though in reality there was little more they could do. They might stay and search for weeks without much chance of success. The fresh snow destroyed their only hope, and they gathered round the fire for supper, a gloomy and despondent party. The facts, indeed, were sad enough, for Defago had a wife at Ratbartage, and his earnings were the family's sole means of support. Now that the whole truth in all its ugliness was out, it seemed useless to deal further and disguise our pretense. They talked openly of the facts and possibilities, and not for the first time, even in the experience of Dr. Cathcart, that a man had yielded to the singular suggestion of the solitudes, and out of his mind. Paegan, moreover, was predisposed to something of the sort, for he already had a touch of the melancholia in his blood, and his fibre was weakened by bouts of drinking that often lasted for weeks at a time. Something on this trip, one might never know precisely what, had sufficed to push him over the line, and that was all. And he was gone off into the great wilderness of trees and lakes to die by starvation and exhaustion. The chances against his finding camp again were overwhelming. The delirium that was upon him would almost doubtless have increased, and it was quite likely that he would do violence to himself and so hasten his cruel fate. Even while they talked, indeed, the end had probably come. On the suggestion of Hank, his old power, however, they proposed to wait a little longer and devote the whole of the following day, from dawn to darkness, to the most systematic search that they could devise. They would divide the territory between them. They discussed their plan in great detail. All that men could do, they would do. And meanwhile, they talked about the particular farm in which the singular panic of the wilderness had made its attack upon the mind of the unfortunate guide. Hank, though familiar with the legend in its general outline, obviously did not welcome the turn in conversation that it had taken. He contributed little, though that little was illuminating, for he admitted that a story ran over all this section of the country to the effect that several Indians had seen the Wendigo along the long shores of 50 Island Water in the fall of the last year, and that this was the true reason of the Paegan's disinclination to hunt there. Hank doubtless felt that he had, in a sense, helped his old pal to death by over-persuading him. When an Indian goes crazy, he explained, talking to himself more than to others, it seemed, it's always put as he's seen the Wendigo. And poor old Paegan was superstitious, down to the very heels. And then Simpson, feeling the atmosphere more sympathetic, told over again the full story of his astonishing tale. He left out no details this time. He mentioned his own sensations and gripping fears. He only admitted the strange language used. But Paegan surely had already told you all these details of the Wendigo legend, my dear fellow, insisted the doctor. I mean, I had talked about it, and thus put into your mind the ideas which his own excitement afterwards developed. Whereupon Simpson again repeated the facts. But Paegan, he declared, had barely mentioned the beast. Hey, Simpson knew nothing of the story and so far as I remembered, had never even read about it. Even the word was unfamiliar. Of course I was telling the truth, and Dr. Cathcart was reluctantly compelled to admit the singular character of the whole affair. He did not do this in words, so much as in manner, however. He kept his back against a good, stout tree. He pushed the fire into place the moment it showed signs of dying down. He was quicker than any of them to notice the least sign in the night about them. A fish jumping in the lake, a twig snapping in the bush, the dropping of occasional fragments of fallen snow from the branches overhead where the heat had loosened them. His face, too, changed a little in quality, becoming a shade less confident, lower also in tone. Fear, to put it plainly, hovered close about the little camp, and though all three would have been glad to speak of other matters, the only thing they seemed to be able to discuss was this: the source of their fear. They tried other subjects in vain. There was nothing to say about them. Hank was the most honest of the group. He said next to nothing. He never once, however, turned his back to face the darkness. His face was always to the forest, and when what was needed, he didn't go farther than necessary to get it.